Historical Rabbit Hole: The True Pagan Origin of Adam and Eve. In the dusty archives of ancient Mesopotamia, carved into clay tablets that predate the Bible by over 1,000 years, lies a story that will fundamentally challenge everything you thought you knew about Adam and Eve. What if I told you that the tale of humanity's first couple, their forbidden fruit, and their fall from grace wasn't divinely revealed to Hebrew scribes, but borrowed, almost word for word, from pagan creation myths that were already ancient when Abraham was born? The evidence is overwhelming, the parallels are undeniable, and the implications are staggering. Because what cover isn't just academic, we're about to uncuriosity. It's a complete rewriting of religious history. We're talking about goddesses transformed into subordinate wives, divine trees stripped of their sacred power, and serpents recast from wisdom givers to symbols of evil. This is the story of how one of the world's most influential religious narratives was carefully constructed from the scattered pieces of older, more complex mythologies. And here's the thing that makes this so fascinating. The Hebrew scribes weren't trying to hide this borrowing. In fact, the linguistic evidence, the archaeological discoveries, and the textual parallels are so obvious that once you see them, you can't unsee them. We're going to trace the evolution of these stories from their polytheistic origins through their monotheistic transformation. And by the end, you'll understand exactly how the Adam and Eve you know came to be, and why it matters more than you might think. But before we dive into the rabbit hole, let me be clear about something. This isn't about debunking anyone's faith or proving anyone wrong. This is about understanding how stories travel, how cultures influence each other, and how the most powerful narratives in human history were crafted by brilliant writers who drew from the rich mythological traditions of their time. What we're exploring is the fascinating process of literary adaptation and theological innovation that gave birth to one of civilization's most enduring tales. So buckle up, because we're about to journey back 4,000 years to discover the true pagan origins of Adam and Eve. Let's start with the moment that changed everything. In the mid-19th century, European archaeologists were digging through the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, expecting to find evidence that would confirm the Bible's historical accuracy. What they found instead turned biblical scholarship upside down. As cuneiform tablets were unearthed and translated, a shocking reality emerged. Many of the Bible's most famous stories weren't original at all. They were adaptations, refinements, and theological reinterpretations of much older Mesopotamian myths. The discovery that rocked the scholarly world was the Enuma Elish, often called the Babylonian Genesis. Dating back to at least 1800 BCE, centuries before the composition of Genesis, this epic creation myth contained elements that were immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the Bible. But here's where it gets interesting. The parallels weren't just thematic, they were linguistic, structural, and incredibly specific. In the Enuma Elish, creation begins not with nothingness, but with primordial chaos represented by the goddess Tiamat, who personifies the sea. The Hebrew Bible refers to this same primordial chaos as the deep. But here's the kicker. The Hebrew word is tehom, which linguists have proven is directly related to Tiamat. This isn't coincidence. This is evidence of direct literary borrowing, a smoking gun that reveals how Hebrew scribes adapted Babylonian source material for their own theological purposes. The story gets even more compelling when we look at the creation of humanity itself. Nearly every ancient culture has some version of humans being fashioned from clay, but the specific details matter. In Ovid's Metamorphosis, Prometheus creates humans by mixing new-made earth with fresh rainwater. Egyptian myths describe the ram-headed god Kmun creating humans as a potter who molds clay on a potter's wheel. But it's the Sumerian traditions that provide the most direct parallel. The primeval mother goddess Nama created mankind by placing clay in her womb, fashioning servants for the gods. Now here's where the Adam and Eve story gets really interesting. In Mesopotamian mythology, there's a figure called Adamu. Notice the similarity to Adam, created by the god Enki from the dust of the earth in a special garden. The linguistic connection isn't subtle. It's right there in the name, but it goes deeper than that. According to some scholars, the biblical Adam may have originated not as the first human, but as a divine figure in earlier Mesopotamian pantheons, specifically the Sumerian god Idim, who was known as the creator of the first human and the protector of humanity. This transformation from god to human represents one of the most significant theological shifts in the development of monotheism. The Hebrew writers took a divine creator figure and reimagined him as the first created being, fundamentally altering the power dynamics of the story while preserving the essential narrative elements. But the most striking parallel comes from the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, which provides what may be the direct source for the creation of Eve from Adam's rib. In this Mesopotamian tale, the god Enki falls ill, and various goddesses are created to heal different parts of his body. One of these goddesses, Ninti, is specifically destined to heal Enki's rib. Here's the fascinating part. Ninti's name means both the Lady of the Rib and the Lady of Life. This dual meaning, rib and life, is exactly what we find with Eve, whose name is connected to life and who was created from a rib. The probability that this is mere coincidence is essentially zero. We're looking at the same specific anatomical detail, the same linguistic wordplay, and the same conceptual framework. The Hebrew writers clearly had access to this Mesopotamian tradition and adapted it for their own theological narrative. Now, let's talk about what might be the most famous borrowed story in all of religious literature: the flood narrative. The parallels between Noah's flood and earlier Mesopotamian flood stories are so extensive and detailed that even conservative scholars acknowledge the connection. We're talking about the Epic of Atrahasis, which predates the biblical account by over 1,000 years. The similarities aren't just thematic, they're remarkably specific. In both stories, a divine figure warns a righteous man of an impending flood sent to destroy humanity. In both, the hero is commanded to build a massive boat to specific dimensions. In both, he takes animals aboard to preserve life. In both, he sends out birds to test for dry land, first a raven, then a dove. And in both, the first act after the flood is offering a sacrifice, with the divine beings responding positively to the aroma. Irving Finkel, one of the world's leading experts on cuneiform texts, concluded definitively, "The iconic story of the flood, Noah, and the ark as we know it today certainly originated in the landscape of ancient Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. The evidence is so overwhelming that it's no longer a matter of scholarly debate. It's established fact. But here's what makes this borrowing so sophisticated. The Hebrew writers didn't just copy these stories wholesale. They transformed them, adapting the theological framework to serve monotheistic purposes, while preserving the narrative power that had made these stories compelling for millennia. Where the Mesopotamian flood is sent because humans rebelled against their slave labor to the gods, the biblical flood is attributed to human wickedness and moral corruption. Same story, different theology. The figure of the serpent in Eden provides another fascinating example of this transformation process. To modern readers, especially Christians, the serpent represents Satan and ultimate evil. But to the ancient authors of Genesis, the snake represented something much older, the trickster figure found in mythologies worldwide. From Loki in Norse mythology, to Anansi in African traditions, to Raven in Pacific Northwest Native American myths, the trickster is a universal archetype, a boundary-crossing figure who brings both wisdom and chaos. In the ancient Near East, serpents were universally associated with divine wisdom and power. They were used in divination, healing, and the pursuit of knowledge. The serpent's promise of wisdom in the Garden of Eden would have been entirely consistent with broader cultural expectations. What the Hebrew writers did was take this positive serpent symbolism and reframe it within their theological framework. transforming the wisdom giver into a deceiver. This transformation reflects a broader pattern we see throughout Genesis: the systematic reinterpretation of pagan religious symbols to serve monotheistic theology. The sacred trees that were central to goddess worship throughout the ancient world become forbidden objects in Eden. The divine feminine figures that played crucial roles in earlier creation myths are either eliminated entirely or transformed into subordinate human characters. Take the figure of Lilith, for example. In Mesopotamian tradition, she was a powerful wind spirit associated with untamed feminine energy. Later Jewish tradition transformed her into Adam's first wife, banished from Eden for refusing to submit to male authority. This transformation reveals how patriarchal monotheism dealt with powerful feminine divine figures from earlier traditions by domesticating them, subordinating them, or casting them as demons. The tree of knowledge of good and evil itself reflects this pattern of transformation. Sacred trees were central to ancient pagan religions throughout the Near East, often associated with goddess figures and divine wisdom. In Norse mythology, Yggdrasil is the cosmic tree of both knowledge and life. Hindu mythology speaks of the Aswatha, the inverted cosmic tree whose roots reach the heavens. The biblical prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge may represent a direct polemic against these pagan tree worship traditions. What we're witnessing in Genesis is a sophisticated literary and theological project, the careful adaptation of older mythological traditions to serve a revolutionary new religious vision. The Hebrew writers weren't primitive plagiarists. They were skilled theologians and storytellers who understood the power of familiar narratives to communicate new ideas. This process of adaptation and transformation didn't happen in isolation. The crucial period appears to have been the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, when Hebrew scribes found themselves living directly among the keepers of these ancient Mesopotamian traditions. It was during this period of cultural contact and theological reflection that many of the Bible's most famous stories took their final form. The archaeological evidence supports this timeline perfectly. Cylinder seals from post-Akkadian Mesopotamia, dating to around 2300 BCE, show two figures seated on either side of a tree, reaching for its fruit, with a serpent between them. This iconography predates the biblical account by over a millennium, proving that the essential elements of the Eden story were already present in Mesopotamian culture long before Genesis was written. What makes this evidence so compelling is its specificity. We're not talking about vague similarities or universal human themes. We're talking about precise linguistic connections, detailed narrative parallels, and exact iconographic matches. The conclusion is inescapable. The Adam and Eve story, as we know it, was carefully constructed from pre-existing Mesopotamian source material. But here's what makes this discovery so important. It doesn't diminish the power or significance of these stories. Instead, it reveals the sophisticated process by which universal human concerns about origins, morality, and meaning get encoded into narrative form. The Hebrew writers were participating in a tradition as old as civilization itself, the tradition of using story to make sense of existence. Understanding the pagan origins of Adam and Eve opens up entirely new ways of reading these ancient texts. Instead of seeing them as historical accounts or divine revelations dropped from heaven, we can appreciate them as the products of human creativity, theological innovation, and cross-cultural dialogue. We can see how different cultures wrestled with the same fundamental questions and how stories evolved as they traveled from one civilization to another. The implications extend far beyond academic curiosity. Once you understand how these narratives were constructed, you begin to see the patterns everywhere, the way stories adapt, the way theological concepts evolve, the way human cultures influence each other across time and space. You realize that what we call religious truth is often the product of incredibly sophisticated literary and theological work by ancient writers who were far more cosmopolitan and intellectually curious than we often give them credit for. And we're just getting started, because the rabbit hole goes much deeper than simple borrowing and adaptation. As we'll discover, the transformation of these pagan myths into biblical narrative involved the systematic suppression of feminine divine power, the domestication of nature-based spirituality, and the theological architecture that would shape Western civilization for millennia to come. The deeper we dig into this archaeological treasure trove, the more we realize that the story of Adam and Eve wasn't just borrowed, it was systematically reconstructed to serve a radical new theological agenda. And nowhere is this more evident than in the deliberate erasure and transformation of the divine feminine that dominated ancient Near Eastern religion for thousands of years. Picture this. Before the Hebrew scribes began their theological revolution, the ancient world was saturated with powerful goddess figures who controlled creation, fertility, wisdom, and the very forces of life itself. These weren't minor deities relegated to the margins of religious life. They were the primary divine powers that people turned to for everything from childbirth to harvest, from healing to prophecy. The archaeological record is crystal clear on this point. Goddess worship was the dominant religious paradigm across Mesopotamia, Canaan, Egypt, and the broader ancient Near East. But here's where it gets fascinating. When we examine the Genesis narrative with fresh eyes, we can see the ghostly outlines of these suppressed goddess traditions embedded right in the text. The Hebrew writers didn't completely eliminate these feminine divine figures. They transformed them, domesticated them, and stripped them of their power while preserving just enough of the original stories to maintain narrative continuity. Take the figure of Eve herself. Modern readers see her as simply the first woman, Adam's helper and companion. But the linguistic evidence suggests something far more complex. The name Eve has been connected to the Hurrian goddess Khepet, who was actually worshipped in Jerusalem during the late Bronze Age, centuries before the composition of Genesis. Even more intriguingly, some scholars have noted that the Hebrew name for Eve bears resemblance to an Aramaic word for serpent, linking her directly to the wisdom-bringing snake that plays such a crucial role in the Eden narrative. This connection isn't random. Throughout the ancient Near East, serpents were associated with goddess figures who controlled sacred knowledge, healing, and the mysteries of life and death. The fact that Eve's name echoes serpent terminology suggests that she may have originally been a much more powerful figure, perhaps a goddess of wisdom or sacred knowledge, who was gradually demoted to the role of subordinate wife and scapegoat for humanity's fall. The pattern becomes even clearer when we look at the mysterious figure of Lilith, who appears in later Jewish tradition as Adam's first wife. According to these accounts, Lilith was created equal to Adam, but was banished from Eden for refusing to submit to male authority. The origins of Lilith clearly lie in Mesopotamian demonology, where she was a powerful wind spirit associated with untamed feminine energy and independence. The transformation of this autonomous divine figure into a cautionary tale about female disobedience reveals exactly how patriarchal monotheism dealt with powerful goddess traditions by recasting them as threats to divine and social order. But the suppression of feminine divinity goes even deeper than individual character transformations. The entire theological framework of Genesis represents a systematic inversion of ancient Near Eastern religious priorities. Where earlier traditions celebrated the creative power of goddesses, Genesis attributes all creative authority to a single male deity. Where earlier myths featured divine couples working in partnership to create and sustain the world, Genesis presents a lone god creating through pure will and word. This wasn't just theological innovation, it was ideological revolution. The Hebrew writers were consciously constructing a religious system that would fundamentally alter humanity's relationship to the divine, to nature, and to each other. And they did it by taking the most compelling elements of older religious traditions and re-engineering them to serve entirely new purposes. Consider the sacred tree traditions that were absolutely central to ancient pagan worship. Throughout the ancient world, sacred trees served as cosmic axes connecting heaven, earth, and the underworld. They were associated with goddess figures who dispensed wisdom, healing, and divine knowledge to those who approached them with proper reverence. The tree wasn't just a symbol, it was a living conduit to divine power, often tended by priestesses who served as intermediaries between human and divine realms. The tree of knowledge of good and evil in Genesis represents a brilliant theological sleight of hand. The Hebrew writers took this universally recognized symbol of divine wisdom and access to sacred knowledge and transformed it into a forbidden object, a test of obedience rather than a source of enlightenment. Where earlier traditions encourage communion with the sacred tree to gain divine wisdom, Genesis warns that such communion leads to death and exile. This transformation reveals the deeper agenda at work in Genesis: the systematic replacement of experiential nature-based spirituality with rule-based authoritarian religion. Where earlier traditions taught that divine knowledge could be accessed directly through sacred sites, rituals, and communion with divine feminine figures, Genesis establishes a hierarchical system where access to divine truth is mediated exclusively through male authority figures following divine commands. The implications of this theological revolution were staggering. By recasting the quest for wisdom as disobedience, the Hebrew writers fundamentally altered humanity's relationship to knowledge itself. Instead of celebrating the human desire to understand divine mysteries, Genesis presents this desire as the source of all human suffering. Instead of honoring the feminine principle as a source of wisdom and life, it makes women responsible for humanity's fall from grace. But here's what makes this transformation so psychologically powerful. The Hebrew writers didn't completely eliminate the older mythological elements that people found compelling. Instead, they preserved them within a new theological framework that inverted their original meanings. The result was a narrative that felt familiar enough to be psychologically satisfying while advancing a completely revolutionary religious agenda. This process becomes even more evident when we examine the flood narrative in detail. The Mesopotamian flood stories weren't just about divine punishment. They were complex theological meditations on the relationship between gods and humans, the nature of justice, and the possibility of renewal after catastrophe. In the Epic of Atrahasis, the flood is sent because humans rebelled against their enslavement to the gods, making it fundamentally a story about resistance to oppression and the divine response to that resistance. The Hebrew adaptation transforms this narrative of rebellion into a story about moral corruption and divine judgment. Where the Mesopotamian version presents a complex political and theological situation with multiple divine perspectives, the biblical version simplifies the narrative into a clear moral framework. Humans become wicked, God responds with judgment, and the righteous are saved. Same basic story structure, completely different ideological message. This pattern of simplification and moral reframing appears throughout Genesis. Complex, polytheistic narratives with multiple divine perspectives and ambiguous moral implications get streamlined into clear, monotheistic parables with obvious moral lessons. The sophisticated theological debates embedded in earlier traditions get reduced to simple obedience-disobedience frameworks. But perhaps the most revealing transformation involves the figure of the serpent itself. In ancient Near Eastern tradition, serpents were universally associated with divine wisdom, healing, and renewal. The serpent's ability to shed its skin made it a powerful symbol of rebirth and transformation. Its connection to the earth made it a mediator between the underworld and the surface world. Its role in divination and healing made it a symbol of access to divine knowledge. The Hebrew writers took this positive serpent symbolism and inverted it completely. Instead of a wisdom giver, the serpent becomes a deceiver. Instead of offering genuine divine knowledge, it offers false promises. Instead of facilitating human spiritual development, it becomes the agent of humanity's downfall. This transformation reveals the systematic way that Genesis reframes older religious symbols to serve new theological purposes. What's particularly striking is how this inversion works psychologically. The serpent's promise in Genesis, "You will be like God, knowing good and evil," would have resonated powerfully with ancient audiences familiar with serpent wisdom traditions. The promise sounds exactly like what serpents offered in older religious contexts: access to divine knowledge and spiritual transformation. The Hebrew writers used this familiar expectation to create a narrative trap, where what appears to be traditional serpent wisdom turns out to be deception and destruction. This sophisticated manipulation of audience expectations reveals just how carefully crafted the Genesis narrative really is. The Hebrew writers weren't primitive storytellers working with crude materials. They were skilled theologians and literary artists who understood exactly how to use familiar mythological elements to advance revolutionary new ideas about the nature of divinity, humanity, and moral authority. The archaeological evidence continues to support this interpretation. Excavations throughout the ancient Near East have revealed the widespread nature of goddess worship, serpent symbolism, and sacred tree traditions that Genesis systematically reframes. We're not dealing with isolated similarities or coincidental parallels. We're looking at the systematic theological appropriation and transformation of an entire religious worldview. Temple complexes throughout Canaan and Mesopotamia show clear evidence of goddess worship integrated with sacred tree and serpent symbolism. Figurines, seals, and artwork depict divine feminine figures associated with trees, serpents, and the dispensation of wisdom. The very religious landscape that the Hebrew writers inhabited was saturated with these older traditions, making their systematic reinterpretation all the more remarkable. But here's what makes this story so compelling from a historical perspective. We can actually trace the process of transformation. The biblical text itself preserves evidence of earlier traditions that were gradually suppressed or reinterpreted. References to Asherah, the Canaanite goddess associated with sacred trees, appear throughout the Hebrew Bible, usually in contexts where the biblical writers are condemning her worship. This suggests that goddess traditions remained popular among ordinary Israelites long after the official theological establishment had rejected them. The tension between popular religious practice and official theological doctrine helps explain why the Genesis narrative had to be so carefully crafted. The Hebrew writers couldn't simply reject the older mythological traditions outright. They were too deeply embedded in the cultural consciousness of their audience. Instead, they had to create a narrative that acknowledged these traditions while fundamentally reframing their meaning and significance. This process of cultural negotiation and theological innovation makes the Adam and Eve story far more interesting than a simple tale of divine revelation or primitive mythology. What we're looking at is evidence of sophisticated intellectual work by ancient theologians who understood how to use familiar narrative elements to advance revolutionary new ideas about the nature of ultimate reality. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond ancient history. Understanding how the Adam and Eve narrative was constructed from older mythological materials reveals the complex process by which religious ideas develop, adapt, and spread across cultures. It shows us that what we often think of as timeless religious truths are actually the products of specific historical circumstances, cultural interactions, and theological innovations by particular communities at particular moments in time. This doesn't diminish the power or significance of these stories. If anything, it makes them more remarkable. The fact that ancient Hebrew theologians could take disparate mythological traditions from across the ancient Near East and weave them into a coherent narrative that has shaped Western civilization for over 2 millennia is a testament to their intellectual sophistication and literary skill. But it also raises profound questions about religious authority, historical accuracy, and the nature of divine revelation that continue to resonate today. Once you understand how these foundational stories were actually constructed, you can never read them the same way again. And as we'll discover, the rabbit hole goes even deeper than literary borrowing and theological adaptation. Because the creation of the Adam and Eve narrative wasn't just about constructing new religious stories. It was about fundamentally restructuring human society itself. The transformation we've been exploring wasn't happening in some abstract theological vacuum. It was taking place during one of the most traumatic and formative periods in ancient Hebrew history, the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE. This is when everything clicks into place, when all these mythological borrowings and theological innovations suddenly make perfect historical sense. Picture the scene. Jerusalem has fallen, the temple is destroyed, and the Hebrew intellectual elite find themselves forcibly relocated to Babylon, the very heart of Mesopotamian civilization. They're not just political prisoners, they're cultural refugees, thrust into direct contact with the oldest and most sophisticated mythological traditions in the world. For the first time, Hebrew scribes have unlimited access to the vast libraries of cuneiform tablets that preserve thousands of years of Mesopotamian religious thought. But here's the crucial part. They're not passive recipients of this cultural inheritance. They're traumatized survivors of national catastrophe, grappling with fundamental questions about their identity, their covenant with their God, and their future as a people. The exile isn't just a political crisis. It's an existential emergency that demands new theological frameworks and fresh religious narratives. This is the crucible in which Genesis was forged. The Hebrew scribes weren't simply copying Mesopotamian stories for entertainment or cultural preservation. They were engaged in an urgent project of theological reconstruction, using familiar mythological materials to build a new religious foundation that could sustain their community through crisis and beyond. The Adam and Eve narrative emerges from this context as a sophisticated piece of crisis theology disguised as ancient history. The evidence for this timeline is overwhelming. Linguistic analysis reveals that many of the most distinctively Mesopotamian elements in Genesis show up in Hebrew during exactly this period. Technical vocabulary, narrative structures, and theological concepts that were foreign to earlier Hebrew literature suddenly appear in texts that scholars can date to the exilic and post-exilic periods. We're not looking at gradual cultural transmission over centuries. We're seeing rapid, intensive borrowing during a specific historical moment. But the borrowing wasn't random or unconscious. The Hebrew scribes were making deliberate choices about which elements to preserve, which to modify, and which to reject entirely. Every adaptation served their larger theological and political agenda, creating a religious system that could maintain Hebrew identity while competing successfully with the powerful imperial religions they encountered in Babylon. This competitive dimension is crucial to understanding why the Adam and Eve story took the specific form it did. The Hebrew scribes weren't writing for themselves. They were writing for a community that was constantly exposed to alternative religious narratives that claimed to explain the fundamental questions of human existence. Babylonian creation myths, Persian dualistic theology, Egyptian afterlife doctrines. All of these competing systems offered compelling answers to the same questions that Genesis addresses. The genius of the Genesis narrative lies in how it incorporates familiar elements from these competing traditions while subtly undermining their theological foundations. Take the creation sequence itself. Where Babylonian creation myths feature violent conflicts between chaotic forces and ordering deities, Genesis presents creation as the peaceful, orderly work of a single supreme being. Same cosmic scope, completely different vision of divine power and cosmic harmony. This wasn't accidental. The Hebrew scribes understood that their audience needed a creation story that could compete with Babylonian epics in terms of grandeur and cosmic significance. But they also needed it to advance their own theological agenda about the nature of divine authority and human responsibility. The result is a narrative that feels familiar enough to be psychologically satisfying, while being revolutionary enough to reshape religious consciousness. The Adam and Eve story serves a similar competitive function. Ancient audiences were familiar with stories about primordial humans divine gardens, and the loss of immortality from multiple cultural traditions. But the Hebrew version takes these universal themes and uses them to advance specific theological claims about the relationship between divine authority and human freedom, the nature of moral knowledge, and the consequences of autonomous decision-making. What makes this so psychologically powerful is how the narrative uses familiar mythological expectations to create surprise and cognitive dissonance. Ancient readers would have expected the quest for divine knowledge to be portrayed positively. That's how it worked in most mythological traditions. The shock of having this expectation violated creates a memorable narrative moment that reinforces the theological message about obedience and authority. This technique appears throughout the narrative. The serpent speaks and offers wisdom, exactly what ancient audiences would expect from serpent figures in religious stories. But instead of delivering genuine wisdom, it delivers deception and destruction. The tree offers divine knowledge, exactly what sacred trees offered in ancient religious traditions. But instead of enlightenment, it brings exile and death. The Hebrew writers systematically used familiar mythological tropes to create unexpected theological reversals. These reversals weren't just literary devices, they were tools of cultural resistance and religious innovation. By taking the most recognizable elements of ancient Near Eastern religion and inverting their traditional meanings, the Hebrew scribes created a narrative that simultaneously acknowledged and rejected the religious worldview of their imperial captors. It's cultural appropriation in service of theological independence. The sophistication of this strategy becomes even more apparent when we examine how it functions on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, Genesis appears to be telling a simple story about the first humans and their relationship with their creator. But beneath this surface narrative, it's conducting a systematic critique of ancient Near Eastern religious assumptions about divine plurality, cosmic conflict, and the nature of sacred knowledge. The theological implications were revolutionary. Where ancient Near Eastern religions typically featured pantheons of specialized deities who needed to be approached through complex ritual systems, Genesis presents a single deity who creates through pure will and communicates directly with humans. Where earlier traditions often portrayed divine knowledge as something humans could access through ritual, divination, or communion with sacred sites, Genesis presents such knowledge as fundamentally off-limits to human beings. This wasn't just theological innovation, it was social engineering on a massive scale. The Hebrew scribes were using familiar mythological narratives to advance a completely new vision of religious authority, social organization, and individual responsibility. They were creating the intellectual foundation for a religious system that would prove remarkably successful at maintaining community coherence across cultural boundaries and historical changes. The success of this strategy is evident in how the Genesis narrative functions in later Jewish and Christian tradition. Despite being constructed from obviously non-Hebrew sources, it becomes the foundational story that defines Jewish identity and shapes Christian theology. The borrowed elements don't undermine its authority. They enhance its psychological power by tapping into universal human mythological expectations while redirecting them toward new theological conclusions. But the cultural impact extends far beyond religious communities. The Genesis narrative introduces conceptual frameworks that fundamentally reshape Western civilization's approach to questions of authority, knowledge, and moral responsibility. The idea that seeking unauthorized knowledge is inherently dangerous, the notion that suffering results from moral failure, the assumption that proper relationships require hierarchical submission, all of these concepts trace back to theological innovations embedded in the Adam and Eve story. This is where the pagan origins of Adam and Eve become more than just historical curiosity. Understanding how these concepts were constructed from earlier mythological materials reveals their contingent, culturally specific character. What often gets presented as universal human truth turns out to be the product of particular historical circumstances and specific theological agendas. The archaeological evidence continues to support this interpretation. Excavations at sites throughout Mesopotamia and the Levant reveal the rich religious landscape from which Genesis emerged. Temple complexes, ritual objects, and artistic representations show how goddess worship, sacred tree traditions, and serpent symbolism functioned in their original cultural contexts before being appropriated and transformed by Hebrew theological innovation. Particularly revealing are the cylinder seals and other artifacts that preserve iconographic traditions predating Genesis by centuries or millennia. These objects show that the essential narrative elements of the Eden story, human figures, sacred trees, serpent wisdom givers, were already established as recognizable mythological motifs long before Hebrew scribes began their theological reconstruction project. What makes this evidence so compelling is its consistency across time and geography. From Sumerian temple art to Babylonian ritual objects to Canaanite religious figurines, we see the same basic symbolic complex appearing again and again, divine feminine figures associated with sacred trees and serpent wisdom. The Hebrew transformation of this complex into the Eden narrative represents not the origin of these traditions, but their systematic theological reinterpretation. This reinterpretation process reveals something fascinating about how religious ideas actually develop and spread. Rather than emerging from divine revelation or pure human creativity, the most influential religious narratives typically result from sophisticated processes of cultural borrowing, theological adaptation, and narrative innovation. The Adam and Eve story exemplifies this process in remarkable detail. The implications for understanding religious authority and scriptural interpretation are profound. Once you recognize how extensively Genesis borrows from earlier mythological traditions, traditional claims about its unique divine origin become much harder to maintain. Instead, what emerges is a picture of brilliant human theological work that deserves respect for its intellectual sophistication and cultural impact, rather than its supernatural origins. This doesn't diminish the story's significance. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. The fact that ancient Hebrew theologians could take disparate mythological elements from across the ancient world and synthesize them into a coherent narrative that has shaped human consciousness for millennia demonstrates extraordinary intellectual achievement. Understanding the pagan origins of Adam and Eve reveals not divine dictation, but human genius working with inherited cultural materials to create something genuinely new. The process of discovery itself tells an important story about how knowledge develops and spreads. For centuries, Genesis was read as a unique, divinely revealed account of human origins. The 19th century archaeological discoveries that revealed its mythological sources created a crisis for traditional interpretation that scholars are still working through today. This ongoing process of reinterpretation shows how new evidence can fundamentally alter our understanding of even the most familiar cultural materials. But perhaps the most important implication involves how we understand the relationship between religious truth and historical accuracy. The pagan origins of Adam and Eve demonstrate that powerful religious narratives don't depend on literal historical accuracy for their cultural significance. Instead, their power lies in their ability to encode universal human concerns about meaning, morality, and identity in memorable, psychologically compelling forms. This perspective opens up new possibilities for reading ancient texts that don't depend on defending their historical accuracy or supernatural origins. Instead of asking whether these stories literally happened, we can ask how they work as cultural artifacts, what psychological needs they address, and how they've shaped human consciousness across time and geography. The Adam and Eve narrative, understood in its full historical and cultural context, becomes a window into one of the most significant intellectual achievements in human history: the systematic transformation of ancient mythological traditions into the foundation of monotheistic religion. The accomplished this transformation weren't passive Hebrew scribes who were recipients of divine revelation. They were creative theologians working with inherited cultural materials to address the urgent needs of their community. Understanding this process doesn't resolve the theological questions that Genesis raises. If anything, it makes them more complex and interesting. But it does provide crucial context for approaching these questions with appropriate intellectual honesty and historical awareness. The pagan origins of Adam and Eve reveal not the failure of religious truth, but the sophisticated human processes through which religious truths get constructed, transmitted, and continuously reinterpreted across cultures and centuries. And we're still not done, because the theological revolution that created the Adam and Eve story didn't just reshape ancient Hebrew religion. It established patterns of religious authority, gender relations, and cosmic understanding that continue to shape Western civilization today. The rabbit hole leads not just backward into ancient history, but forward into the contemporary world, where these ancient theological innovations continue to influence how millions of people understand themselves, their relationships, and their place in the cosmic order. The deeper we excavate these ancient foundations, the more we realize that understanding the pagan origins of Adam and Eve isn't just about correcting historical misconceptions. It's about comprehending the intellectual architecture that still structures much of human religious and moral consciousness. And that architecture, as we're about to discover, was built on foundations that its creators deliberately obscured, creating mysteries that scholars are only now beginning to fully unravel. The theological architecture we've been exploring had consequences that extended far beyond ancient religious debates. What the Hebrew scribes accomplished during the Babylonian exile wasn't just literary adaptation. It was the systematic construction of new frameworks for understanding power, knowledge, and human relationships that would echo through millennia. And nowhere is this more evident than in how these ancient innovations shaped the very foundations of patriarchal authority that continue to influence Western civilization today. Consider what happened to the concept of divine knowledge itself. In the religious traditions that Genesis borrowed from, access to sacred wisdom was typically mediated through priestesses, sacred sites, and direct communion with divine forces. Knowledge wasn't something you received through hierarchical authority. It was something you experienced through ritual participation, mystical encounter, and spiritual discipline. The goddess traditions of the ancient Near East offered multiple pathways to divine understanding, often emphasizing personal transformation and direct spiritual experience. The Genesis narrative fundamentally altered this paradigm. By making the quest for divine knowledge the original sin, the Hebrew writers didn't just tell a story about disobedience. They created a theological framework that would justify restricting access to sacred knowledge to authorized male interpreters for thousands of years to come. The tree of knowledge becomes not a symbol of available wisdom, but a warning about the dangers of unauthorized spiritual seeking. This transformation had immediate practical consequences for how religious communities organized themselves. Where earlier traditions often featured female religious specialists who served as intermediaries between human and divine realms, the post-Genesis religious world increasingly concentrated spiritual authority in male hierarchies. The goddess traditions that had provided alternative sources of religious legitimacy were systematically marginalized, replaced by systems that derived their authority from correct interpretation of divinely revealed texts. But the implications went deeper than religious organization. The Adam and Eve narrative established conceptual patterns that would shape Western thinking about the relationship between knowledge and authority for centuries to come. The idea that certain kinds of knowledge are inherently dangerous, that wisdom must be mediated through proper channels, that autonomous intellectual investigation represents a form of rebellion against legitimate authority. All of these concepts trace their lineage back to the theological innovations embedded in Genesis. The transformation of Eve from what may have originally been a divine wisdom figure into a subordinate human who brings destruction through her desire for knowledge represents one of the most consequential character assassinations in literary history. This wasn't just storytelling, it was the mythological foundation for centuries of restrictions on women's access to education, religious authority, and intellectual autonomy. The narrative doesn't just explain why women suffer in childbirth. It provides theological justification for why they shouldn't be trusted with important decisions. The psychological power of this narrative framework becomes evident when we consider how it continues to influence contemporary debates about education, scientific research, and religious authority. The suspicion of intellectual curiosity that Genesis encodes, the assumption that certain kinds of knowledge are too dangerous for ordinary people to handle, the notion that proper relationships require hierarchical submission. These aren't just ancient ideas preserved in religious texts. They're active conceptual frameworks that continue to shape political and social discourse today. What makes this so fascinating from a historical perspective is how successfully the Hebrew theological revolution obscured its own origins. For most of Western history, the Genesis narrative was read as divinely revealed truth rather than sophisticated theological adaptation of earlier mythological traditions. This interpretive framework made it almost impossible to recognize the systematic way that Genesis had appropriated and transformed goddess traditions, sacred tree symbolism, and serpent wisdom motifs from across the ancient world. The archaeological discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries that revealed these pagan origins created what scholars call a hermeneutical crisis, a fundamental challenge to traditional methods of biblical interpretation. Once you understand how extensively you can't simply Genesis borrows from earlier sources, read it as unique divine revelation. Instead, you have to grapple with questions about cultural transmission, theological innovation, and the human processes through which religious authority gets constructed and maintained. This crisis reveals something important about how religious traditions actually function. The power of the Genesis narrative didn't depend on its historical originality. It depended on its psychological effectiveness and cultural utility. The Hebrew scribes weren't trying to create historically accurate accounts of primordial events. They were trying to construct compelling theological frameworks that could sustain their community through crisis and provide intellectual foundations for a new kind of religious system. The sophistication of their achievement becomes even more apparent when we consider how successfully they solved the fundamental problem facing any theological innovation: how to introduce revolutionary new ideas while maintaining psychological continuity with familiar cultural materials. The Genesis narrative accomplishes this by preserving recognizable mythological elements while systematically inverting their traditional meanings and implications. This technique appears throughout the biblical corpus, but it reaches its most sophisticated expression in the Adam and Eve story. Every major element, the garden setting, the sacred tree, the wisdom-bringing serpent, the divine knowledge quest, would have been immediately familiar to ancient audiences. But each element gets reframed within a theological system that uses these familiar expectations to advance completely new ideas about divine authority, human responsibility, and the nature of moral knowledge. The genius of this approach lies in how it creates cognitive resonance while facilitating conceptual transformation. Ancient readers could connect emotionally with the narrative because it employed mythological motifs they already understood, but they were simultaneously being introduced to theological frameworks that would fundamentally alter their understanding of themselves and their relationship to ultimate reality. It's psychological programming disguised as storytelling. The long-term cultural impact of this programming has been staggering. The conceptual frameworks established in Genesis provided the intellectual foundation for religious systems that would eventually dominate Western civilization. The notion that divine authority should be mediated through textual interpretation rather than direct spiritual experience. The assumption that moral knowledge comes through obedience to revealed commands rather than autonomous ethical reflection. The idea that proper relationships require hierarchical submission rather than egalitarian partnership. All of these concepts derive from theological innovations first encoded in the Adam and Eve narrative. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence involves how Genesis reshaped Western civilization's relationship to the natural world itself. The earlier mythological traditions that Genesis borrowed from typically portrayed humans as embedded within natural systems that were themselves sacred and alive. Goddess traditions emphasized the interconnectedness of all life, the spiritual significance of natural cycles, and the importance of maintaining harmonious relationships with the living earth. The Genesis narrative systematically dismantled this ecological consciousness. By making humans the pinnacle of creation, by portraying the natural world as existing primarily for human benefit, by removing divine presence from natural phenomena and concentrating it in a transcendent male deity, Genesis laid the intellectual groundwork for the instrumental relationship to nature that would eventually enable both Western technological dominance and ecological destruction. This transformation wasn't accidental. The Hebrew theological revolution was explicitly designed to replace nature-based spirituality with text-based religious authority. Sacred groves, holy mountains, and divine springs, all the natural sites where earlier traditions had located divine presence, get replaced by a single, portable, textual tradition that could maintain religious authority independent of geographical location. It was a brilliant solution to the practical problems facing a displaced community, but it came at the cost of severing the spiritual connections to the natural world that had sustained human communities for millennia. The archaeological evidence reveals the scope of what was lost in this transformation. Excavations throughout the ancient Near East show sophisticated religious traditions that integrated human communities into larger natural and cosmic systems through complex ritual cycles, sacred site networks, and ecological awareness. The goddess traditions that Genesis systematically suppressed weren't primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated spiritual technologies for maintaining sustainable relationships between human communities and the living systems that supported them. The systematic replacement of these traditions with text-based, hierarchically organized religious authority represents one of the most significant cultural transformations in human history. It established patterns of thinking about authority, knowledge, and human nature relationships that would eventually enable both the remarkable achievements and the devastating failures of Western civilization. The Adam and Eve narrative sits at the center of this transformation, encoding the theological assumptions that made it possible. Understanding this historical process doesn't require rejecting the cultural achievements that emerged from it. Western civilization's contributions to human knowledge, artistic expression, and social organization are undeniable. But understanding the pagan origins of foundational narratives like Adam and Eve does reveal the contingent, historically specific character of conceptual frameworks that often get presented as universal human truths. This perspective opens up possibilities for cultural criticism and reconstruction that weren't available when these narratives were understood as divinely revealed truths. Once you recognize how the Genesis story was constructed from earlier mythological materials to serve specific theological and political agendas, you can begin to imagine alternative ways of organizing human relationships, understanding moral authority, and relating to the natural world that draw on different mythological and philosophical traditions. The contemporary relevance of these ancient theological innovations becomes particularly apparent when we consider ongoing debates about religious authority, gender equality, environmental protection, and the relationship between scientific knowledge and spiritual wisdom. The conceptual frameworks established in Genesis continue to influence how these debates unfold, often in ways that participants don't fully recognize or acknowledge. The suspicion of autonomous intellectual investigation that Genesis encodes continues to shape contemporary resistance to scientific findings that challenge traditional religious teachings. The hierarchical understanding of proper relationships that the narrative promotes continues to influence debates about gender roles, family structure, and social organization. The instrumental relationship to the natural world that Genesis establishes continues to undermine efforts to develop more sustainable economic and political systems. These connections aren't abstract or theoretical. The theological innovations embedded in the Adam and Eve narrative continue to function as active cultural forces that shape how millions of people understand themselves, their relationships, and their responsibilities. Understanding the pagan origins of these innovations provides crucial tools for recognizing their historical contingency and imagining alternatives that might better serve contemporary human needs. The process of excavating these ancient foundations also reveals something important about how cultural transformation actually happens. The Hebrew scribes who created the Genesis narrative weren't working in isolation. They were participating in broader cultural conversations about the nature of divine authority, human responsibility, and cosmic order that were taking place throughout the ancient world. Their theological innovations succeeded not because they were divinely inspired, but because they offered compelling solutions to real problems facing their communities. This perspective suggests that contemporary efforts to address the limitations and destructive consequences of Western civilization's dominant mythological frameworks might benefit from similar processes of creative adaptation and theological innovation. Rather than simply rejecting or defending inherited traditions, we might explore how elements from diverse cultural and spiritual traditions could be synthesized into new frameworks that better serve contemporary human needs while remaining psychologically compelling and culturally sustainable. The pagan origins of Adam and Eve reveal not the failure of religious truth, but the ongoing human need to construct meaningful narratives that can make sense of existence, provide moral guidance, and sustain communities through historical challenges. The Hebrew scribes who created this narrative were engaged in essential human work that every generation must undertake: the construction of cultural frameworks that can address the fundamental questions of human existence while responding to the specific challenges and opportunities of their historical moment. Understanding this process doesn't diminish the significance of their achievement. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. The fact that ancient theological innovations continue to influence human consciousness millennia after their creation demonstrates the extraordinary power of well-crafted mythological narratives to shape cultural evolution across vast spans of time and geography. But it also reveals the responsibility that comes with such power. The narratives we construct and the interpretations we promote have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate cultural contexts. The theological frameworks embedded in stories like Adam and Eve continue to influence how people understand themselves and their relationships with each other and the natural world. This ongoing influence makes it crucial that we understand how these frameworks were constructed, what purposes they were designed to serve, and whether they continue to serve human flourishing in contemporary contexts. The rabbit hole of pagan origins leads us not just backward into ancient history, but forward into questions about cultural responsibility and the ongoing human project of constructing meaningful, sustainable ways of life. The Adam and Eve narrative, understood in its full historical and cultural context, becomes not just an ancient story about the first humans, but a window into the ongoing human struggle to create frameworks for understanding existence that can sustain communities, provide moral guidance, and respond effectively to the challenges and opportunities that each generation faces. And as we're about to discover, this ancient struggle continues today, as scholars, religious communities, and cultural critics grapple with the implications of understanding how one of humanity's most influential narratives was actually constructed. The discoveries we've explored don't just change how we read ancient texts. They challenge us to think more deeply about how we construct meaning, organize communities, and understand our place in the larger cosmos. The pagan origins of Adam and Eve reveal not just the past, but possibilities for the future that remain largely unexplored. The contemporary implications of these ancient discoveries extend far beyond academic debate or historical curiosity. We're living through a moment when the very foundations of Western religious thought are being excavated and examined, revealing construction materials that most people never knew existed. And this excavation process is happening at precisely the moment when humanity faces challenges that may require fundamentally different ways of thinking about authority, knowledge, and our relationship to the natural world. Consider what happens when you trace the intellectual lineage of contemporary environmental destruction back to its mythological roots. The Genesis narrative doesn't just tell a story about the first humans. It encodes a specific understanding of humanity's relationship to the natural world that has shaped Western civilization's approach to ecological questions for millennia. The idea that humans are separate from and superior to nature, that the natural world exists primarily for human benefit, that divine presence is located outside rather than within natural systems. All of these assumptions trace back to the theological innovations we've been exploring. But here's where it gets really interesting. The earlier mythological traditions that Genesis appropriated and transformed offered completely different frameworks for understanding human-nature relationships. The goddess traditions of the ancient Near East typically portrayed humans as embedded within sacred natural systems, dependent on maintaining harmonious relationships with the living earth for both physical and spiritual well-being. Sacred trees weren't forbidden objects. They were sources of wisdom and healing. Serpents weren't symbols of deception. They were mediators between different levels of reality. This isn't just historical trivia. These alternative mythological frameworks encode different ways of thinking about sustainability, responsibility, and the proper relationship between human communities and the ecological systems that support them. Understanding how Genesis systematically suppressed these alternatives reveals not just what was lost in the transition to monotheism, but what possibilities remain available for contemporary communities struggling to develop more sustainable ways of life. The process becomes even more complex when we consider how these ancient theological innovations continue to influence contemporary debates about scientific knowledge and religious authority. The suspicion of autonomous intellectual investigation that Genesis encodes, the notion that certain kinds of knowledge are inherently dangerous and should be restricted to authorized interpreters, continues to shape resistance to scientific findings that challenge traditional religious teachings. But this resistance isn't just about defending ancient texts against modern discoveries. It's about protecting entire systems of social organization that depend on maintaining traditional forms of religious authority. The hierarchical structures that trace their legitimacy back to Genesis-based theology have enormous investments in preventing the kind of intellectual autonomy that might lead people to question not just specific religious claims, but the entire framework of mediated spiritual authority that these structures represent. This is why the archaeological discoveries revealing the pagan origins of biblical narratives created such profound cultural anxiety. It wasn't just that scholars had found evidence of literary borrowing. It was that this evidence undermined the entire foundation for religious systems that had organized Western society for centuries. Once people understand how extensively Genesis borrows from earlier mythological traditions, traditional claims about unique divine revelation become much harder to maintain. The implications extend into contemporary politics in ways that most people don't fully recognize. The conceptual frameworks established in Genesis continue to influence how political debates unfold, particularly around questions of authority, expertise, and the proper relationship between knowledge and power. The assumption that wisdom should be mediated through hierarchical authority rather than emerging from autonomous investigation, the notion that questioning established teachings represents a form of dangerous rebellion. The idea that proper relationships require submission to legitimate authority. All of these political concepts have deep roots in the theological innovations we've been exploring. Understanding these connections doesn't provide simple solutions to contemporary political challenges, but it does reveal why certain kinds of arguments resonate so powerfully with particular audiences. People who have been raised within religious traditions that trace back to Genesis carry conceptual frameworks that make them psychologically predisposed to certain kinds of political appeals, even when those appeals are made in secular contexts. The theological programming runs deeper than conscious religious belief. This psychological dimension becomes particularly important when we consider how contemporary movements are attempting to reconstruct more egalitarian and sustainable social systems. Simply advocating for policy changes or institutional reforms may not be sufficient if the underlying mythological frameworks that shape how people understand authority, knowledge, and proper relationships remain unchanged. Lasting cultural transformation may require the kind of theological innovation that the Hebrew scribes accomplished, the systematic construction of new mythological frameworks that can compete successfully with inherited traditions while advancing different visions of human possibility. This is where the study of ancient mythological adaptation becomes more than historical research. It becomes a guide for contemporary cultural work. The Hebrew scribes succeeded in transforming civilization not through political revolution or economic change, but through the careful reconstruction of the foundational narratives that shape human consciousness. They understood that lasting change requires working at, rather than just policy and institution, the level of myth, symbol, and story. Their techniques remain relevant for contemporary efforts to address the limitations and destructive consequences of Western civilization's dominant cultural patterns. The systematic appropriation and reinterpretation of familiar mythological elements, the psychological use of narrative expectations to advance new conceptual frameworks, the integration of diverse cultural traditions into coherent theological systems. All of these approaches could inform contemporary efforts to construct more sustainable and equitable cultural alternatives. But the process also reveals the dangers inherent. The theological innovations embedded in Genesis succeeded in mythological reconstruction projects in transforming civilization, but they also established patterns of thinking that eventually enabled both remarkable cultural achievements and devastating ecological destruction. The suppression of goddess of religious authority, Itziv traditions didn't just eliminate alternative forms of the spiritual connections to the natural world that had sustained human communities' efforts to reconstruct more sustainable myth for millennia. Contemporary didn't. How do you create theological rapport seriously with this historical priest? Innovations that serve immediate logical frameworks, need to G, community needs, without establishing prove destructive over longer conceptual patterns that might time spans. How do you appropriate and transform inherited cultural materials without losing essential wisdom that those materials preserve? How do you construct religious authority that can provide community coherence without becoming oppressive or exclusive? These questions become of contemporary challenges. Climate change, biodiversity loss, particularly urgent when we consider the global scope, social inequality, political polarization. All of these problems may require the kind of fundamental shifts in consciousness that can only be achieved through mythological transformation. But such transformation needs to happen across multiple cultural traditions, simultaneously, unprecedented, requiring levels of cross-cultural dialogue and collaboration. The pagan origins of Adam and Eve provide a useful case study for understanding how such transformation might work. The Hebrew scribes didn't create their theological innovations in isolation. They were participating in broader cultural conversations that were taking place throughout the ancient world. Their success came partly from their ability to synthesize elements from diverse traditions into frameworks that could compete successfully in a multicultural environment. Contemporary mythological reconstruction might require similar synthetic approaches that draw on wisdom traditions from around the world, while remaining sensitive to questions of cultural appropriation and power dynamics. The challenge is to create genuinely inclusive frameworks that can provide psychological coherence for diverse communities, while avoiding the homogenizing tendencies that characterized earlier imperial religious systems. The archaeological evidence continues to reveal the richness of the cultural traditions that were suppressed or transformed during the development of monotheism. Recent discoveries in sites throughout the ancient Near East show sophisticated religious systems that integrated ecological awareness, gender equality, and decentralized spiritual authority in ways that might inform contemporary efforts to construct more sustainable cultural alternatives. These weren't primitive societies that needed to be replaced by more advanced religious systems. They were complex civilizations that had developed spiritual technologies for maintaining sustainable relationships between human communities and the natural systems that supported them. Understanding what was lost in the transition to monotheism provides crucial perspective for contemporary efforts to address the ecological and social crises that Western civilization now faces. The theological innovations that created the modern world also established the conceptual frameworks that make it difficult to respond effectively to the consequences of those innovations. Breaking out of these patterns may require recovering and adapting elements from the mythological traditions that were systematically suppressed during the formation of Western religious thought. But this recovery process needs to be informed by honest acknowledgement of why those traditions were suppressed in the first place. The Hebrew theological revolution succeeded partly because it offered solutions to real problems that earlier religious systems hadn't addressed effectively. The goddess traditions of the ancient world, however sophisticated their ecological awareness, often struggled to maintain political coherence in the face of imperial expansion and cultural disruption. The nature-based spiritual systems that Genesis replaced, however sustainable their environmental practices, sometimes lack the institutional structures needed to preserve their wisdom across generational changes and geographical displacement. Contemporary efforts to reconstruct more sustainable mythological frameworks need to address these historical limitations while preserving the essential insights that earlier traditions developed. This requires sophisticated understanding of how religious systems actually function in practice, not just how they appear in idealized descriptions. It requires attention to questions of institutional sustainability, cross-cultural translation, and practical implementation that go beyond the construction of compelling narratives. The ongoing scholarly work of excavating and interpreting ancient mythological traditions provides essential resources for this reconstruction project, but it also reveals the complexity of the challenges involved. Every new archaeological discovery adds nuance to our understanding of how religious systems actually functioned in their original cultural contexts. But it also complicates efforts to adapt elements from those systems for contemporary use. The cylinder seals, temple complexes, and ritual objects that preserve evidence of ancient goddess traditions don't just show us alternative ways of organizing religious authority, they reveal entire worldviews that integrated spiritual practice, social organization, and ecological awareness in ways that are difficult for people raised in Western cultural contexts to fully comprehend. Adapting elements from these traditions requires not just intellectual understanding, but psychological and spiritual transformation that may take generations to accomplish. This long-term perspective is crucial for understanding why the Hebrew theological revolution was so successful and why contemporary efforts to construct alternative mythological frameworks face such significant challenges. The Genesis narrative didn't transform civilization overnight. It established conceptual foundations that took centuries to fully develop their cultural implications. Contemporary reconstruction efforts need to think in similar timescales, focusing on establishing intellectual and spiritual foundations that can support long-term cultural evolution rather than expecting immediate practical results. The educational implications are particularly important. The discovery of the pagan origins of biblical narratives creates opportunities for teaching approaches that help students understand how religious traditions actually develop and change over time. Instead of presenting religious texts as timeless truths or primitive mythologies, educators can explore them as sophisticated examples of theological innovation and cultural adaptation that remain relevant for understanding contemporary challenges. This educational approach requires careful attention to questions of religious sensitivity and cultural respect, but it also offers possibilities for helping students develop more nuanced understanding of how religious authority actually functions and how spiritual traditions can be evaluated and adapted for contemporary needs. Understanding how the Adam and Eve narrative was constructed from earlier mythological materials provides a concrete example of how human communities have always engaged in the ongoing work of mythological reconstruction. The psychological dimensions of this educational work are particularly complex. Students who have been raised within religious traditions that present Genesis as divinely revealed truth may experience significant cognitive dissonance when confronted with evidence of its pagan origins. But this dissonance can also create opportunities for deeper understanding of how religious meaning actually functions, and how spiritual traditions can remain psychologically powerful even when their historical origins are fully understood. The key is helping students recognize that understanding the human processes through which religious narratives get constructed doesn't necessarily diminish their cultural significance or spiritual value. The Adam and Eve story remains psychologically compelling and culturally influential, regardless of whether it originated through divine revelation or sophisticated theological adaptation. What changes is our understanding of how such narratives function and how they might be evaluated, interpreted, and potentially reconstructed for contemporary purposes. This perspective opens up possibilities for more creative and flexible approaches to religious and spiritual education that don't depend historical accuracy of particular on defending the narratives. Instead of asking whether ancient stories literally happened, educators can explore how they work as cultural artifacts, what psychological needs they address, and how they continue to influence contemporary consciousness. This approach allows for serious engagement with religious traditions while maintaining intellectual honesty about their historical development. The research methodologies that revealed the pagan origins of biblical narratives also provide models for investigating other foundational cultural narratives that shape contemporary consciousness. The same archaeological and textual analysis techniques that uncovered the Mesopotamian sources of Genesis can be applied to exploring the historical development of other influential stories, concepts, and institutions that often get presented as natural or inevitable rather than historically contingent. This broader application of critical historical analysis has the potential to reveal the constructed character of many aspects of contemporary culture that people typically take for granted: economic systems, political institutions, social hierarchies, gender roles, educational practices. All of these cultural patterns have historical origins that can be investigated and understood, potentially opening up possibilities for conscious reconstruction and adaptation. The methodological approach becomes particularly important for understanding how contemporary mythological reconstruction projects might actually work in practice. The Hebrew scribes didn't succeed through pure creativity or divine inspiration. They succeeded through careful study of existing cultural materials, sophisticated understanding of their audience's psychological needs, and strategic thinking about how to advance their theological agenda while maintaining cultural continuity. Contemporary reconstruction efforts could benefit from similar methodological rigor and strategic thinking. This requires moving beyond romantic idealization of either ancient wisdom traditions or contemporary innovation possibilities toward more realistic assessment of what kinds of cultural transformation are actually possible given existing constraints and opportunities. It requires attention to questions of institutional sustainability, cross-cultural communication, and practical implementation that go beyond the construction of intellectually satisfying theoretical frameworks. The global scope of contemporary challenges makes this methodological sophistication particularly crucial. Climate change, social inequality, political polarization, and technological disruption are creating pressures for cultural transformation that may be unprecedented in human history. Responding effectively to these challenges may require mythological reconstruction projects that can function across multiple cultural traditions simultaneously while remaining sensitive to local needs and constraints. The Adam and Eve narrative provides a useful case study for understanding both the possibilities and the dangers inherent in such ambitious reconstruction projects. The theological innovations embedded in Genesis succeeded in transforming civilization, but they also established conceptual patterns that eventually contributed to many of the problems that contemporary humanity now faces. Learning from this historical precedent could help contemporary reconstruction efforts avoid similar unintended consequences while preserving the transformative potential that makes mythological innovation so powerful. The discoveries we've explored reveal not just the pagan origins of one particular biblical narrative, but the ongoing human need to construct meaningful frameworks for understanding existence that can sustain communities through historical challenges while remaining adaptable to changing circumstances. This need continues today as communities around the world struggle to develop cultural alternatives that can address contemporary challenges while preserving essential human values and possibilities. Understanding how the Adam and Eve narrative was actually constructed provides crucial tools for participating consciously in this ongoing cultural work. Instead of being passive recipients of inherited mythological frameworks, we can become active participants in the continuous human project of constructing and reconstructing the stories, symbols, and conceptual systems that shape consciousness and guide community life. The rabbit hole of pagan origins leads us ultimately not just backward into ancient history, but forward into questions about cultural responsibility and human possibility that remain as urgent today as they were for the Hebrew scribes working in Babylonian exile nearly 3 millennia ago. Their theological innovations continue to influence human consciousness because they address fundamental questions about authority, knowledge, and relationship that every generation must answer for itself. The difference is that we now have access to historical perspective that reveals how such innovations actually work and what their long-term consequences might be. This perspective doesn't provide simple answers to contemporary challenges, but it does offer tools for approaching those challenges with greater sophistication and historical awareness. The pagan origins of Adam and Eve reveal not just the past, but possibilities for conscious participation in the ongoing evolution of human consciousness that remain largely unexplored. So here we are, 4,000 years after Hebrew scribes first put stylus to clay in the libraries of Babylon, and the implications of what we've discovered are still unfolding. We've traced the Adam and Eve story from its pagan origins through its brilliant theological transformation, revealing not divine dictation, but human genius, working with inherited cultural materials to create something genuinely revolutionary. The evidence is overwhelming. The linguistic connections to Tiamat and Tehom, the Mesopotamian Adamu, the goddess Ninti, whose name means both Lady of the Rib and Lady of Life, the flood narratives that predate Noah by over a millennium, the systematic transformation of serpent wisdom into serpent deception. What we've uncovered isn't just academic curiosity, it's the archaeological fingerprints of one of history's most sophisticated theological reconstruction projects. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about this discovery is what it reveals about the ongoing human need to construct meaningful narratives that can sustain communities through crisis, while remaining adaptable to changing circumstances. The Hebrew scribes weren't primitive plagiarists. They were brilliant cultural architects who understood how to use familiar mythological elements to advance revolutionary new ideas about authority, knowledge, and human possibility. Understanding this process doesn't diminish the power of these ancient stories. If anything, it makes them more remarkable. The fact that theological innovations created during the Babylonian exile continue to shape human consciousness millennia later demonstrates the extraordinary power of well-crafted mythological narratives to influence cultural evolution across vast spans of time. And here's the thing. This process of mythological reconstruction isn't finished. It's ongoing. Every generation faces the challenge of constructing cultural frameworks that can address fundamental questions about existence while responding to the specific challenges of their historical moment. The rabbit hole of pagan origins leads us not just backward into ancient history, but forward into our own responsibility as conscious participants in the continuing evolution of human consciousness. The ancient scribes who gave us Adam and Eve were doing essential human work that we're still called to do today. The only question is, what stories will we choose to tell?